I wanted to share stories of things that I've experienced and hopefully draw out some lessons that I've found from those. And I wanted to really talk about three main types of communication that I think are problematic. So one is absolutely the over-promising that Andrew talked about, which really also then can often sort of segue into lying or spin, and often over-promising is part of a movement towards spin or lying. Then there's also silence, pure lack of communication, which is also a big problem in communication in the workplace. And then the final thing really is when speech turns into bullying. And so that's, speech that tears down, that demeans, and that makes it very difficult when people use authority inappropriately. So I want to tell you some stories about each of those, and perhaps from that think a little bit about what a Christian response might be to finding yourself in this situation, either as a boss or as someone who has to respond to a boss. There's a lot of workplaces that I've either been part of or I've observed where bosses overpromise. This is also a problem, of course, for employees who overpromise to their boss. But there's a particular example that I can think of where a boss kind of came in and said, we are going to go for this vision. And the vision was so outrageously unlikely, so ridiculous, that essentially you've got two responses as an employee. One response is to say, this boss is clearly a moron. This person has no idea of the industry, they've got no idea of what we are capable of, and you lose all respect for their ability to actually lead you because they clearly have no idea about what we can do. The second response, I think, to this kind of story is that you just get really demoralised and you say, we're never going to reach that standard. It's never going to be good enough. We're going to spend the next 5 or 10 years always failing to reach this particular goal. But this is a problem if you're a boss, because as a boss, one of your key objectives is to inspire, is to paint a vision. And so for a boss, it can actually be quite difficult to navigate the line between inspiration and vision and over-promising and really starting to demoralise people in one of these ways. I actually don't think that it's coincidental that probably the most inspiring speech of the 20th century was, "I have a dream." Not, "We will make this company great again," or this nation great again. Not that. Not a sort of a boldly promising, but instead sharing a heart dream. I have a dream. And I think for bosses, if you're in a situation where you really do want to inspire and you want to give people a vision, but without demoralising them or without them thinking that you are just unrealistic, I think sharing things in terms of your dream is actually a really good way to do that. And then from there, you can start to be realistic about, well, what could we do this year that would get us towards that dream? So that's something that I've experienced and that is really very difficult, I think, if you get it wrong. Now, often overpromising can also occur where you overpromise, if you like, upwards. So you've got a boss and you want to impress your boss. You want to make your boss think like, you're pretty good at your job. And so you promise things that you can never really deliver. This is very close to lying. It's very close to spin. In fact, it probably is lying, and it certainly is spin. Why does this happen, and when does this happen? It happens when we want to look more impressive than we are. This usually comes back to bite you, because if you don't deliver, eventually you get a reputation for not delivering, and this is obviously not good for you in the workplace. When you dress up bad news as good news, and I really loved Andrew's example of the, making people redundant and, talking about the opportunities that this creates. Even, I've been in a position where one of the things that we've had to do is, take away people's car parks, for example. And you sit there with the option of basically saying to people, this is going to be pretty crap for you. And being a bit honest about people's emotions. Or you say, you know what? We are helping with carbon footprint in this company. We are helping you to contribute to a greener planet. Ultimately, spin like that really leads to a lot of cynicism and distrust. But it's always a choice. You can always choose the way that you present things. And I think that people appreciate it when the way you present it aligns with their emotions. So if you know that they're all going to be feeling a bit depressed about this, don't try and spin it, or at least don't spin it too much. Yeah, put some bright sides, if you like, onto it, but acknowledge at least the emotions that they're going to feel, because that is going to create a much better connection with them. And it will feel like you actually are empathizing with them. The second big problem that I've seen, and stories that I might tell, is about silence, lack of communication. I had a boss once who I can only describe as a bit of a black hole for decisions. We would ask this particular person to make a decision, and he would say, "Oh gosh, I really need to think about that. Just leave it with me." You'd kind of go back about once every month, but 2 years later, no decision. And after 2 years, you'd say, "Look, really want to get on with something. Can you tell me?" He's, "Just leave it with me. I'm still thinking about it." So discouraging to not get things done. And that kind of silence and lack of communication can come from a couple of different places. It might be that it's actually wussing out of saying sort of bad news. It might be that this person does not want to do this, but rather than upfront kind of saying, "No, we're never going to do that, and here's why," you wuss out by basically always kind of putting it on hold. So that might be one reason for it. Another reason is because you just kind of don't care about what other people's reactions might be, and a kind of lack of empathy for what then is going on with the person that you're talking to. And then sometimes it's that you're just a bit afraid of what might happen if you make this decision, and you keep putting it off because you don't want to face it. So you might be a conflict avoider, or you simply might not really understand what this behaviour is going to feel like from the employee's point of view. I don't have a lot of great suggestions about what to do in this example if you've got a boss like this. I'll tell you what I did, but I'm not sure it's actually always the best idea. But in my case, we kind of, as a team of people who reported to this person, we firstly talked about it and acknowledged that this was a problem. Secondly, we kind of worked out ways to get around it, and so I actually never asked for decisions after that. I always just said, "Here's what I'm going to do, let me know if you don't want me to." And by actually putting things in that way, most of the time I could do what I wanted to do. And finally, I did, along with the rest of the team, in a very respectful way, talk to this person's boss and say, "Look, there's a problem here, want you to be aware of it, and just want you to know that this is something that you might want to talk to this person about because it's really making the life of the team difficult." Despite the fact, kind of going over that person's head, we did actually also keep that quite confidential. So it wasn't something that we blabbed about around the company, which I think is a really important thing. If you're going to take action like that, you need to make sure that you are respectful to your boss and you're respectful about still giving them the authority that they deserve and not undermining them with the rest of the organisation. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to work for every situation, but it was a way that eventually got around some of those issues. And the final thing I wanted to talk about was speech that demeans, bullying, if you like, in speech. This is something that, unfortunately, I have encountered personally, and it came almost directly from the overpromising. You see, the problem is if you have a boss who overpromises and says, "We're going to do something," and it's clearly outrageous, but we're going to do something, and then starts holding you to it, and you say, "Well, it's not realistic, I can't do that," one of the possible reactions is for that person to actually start threatening you and saying, "Well, I want this done, it has to be done, what's wrong with you that you can't deliver on clearly, unrealistic expectation." That can be pretty difficult for you as an employee. So, how do you deal with it and what do you do? And especially, what do you do if this turns into something that really makes you very uncomfortable in the workplace, where you feel like this, is starting to tip over the edge. I'm starting to be shouted at. I'm starting to have my credibility and my professionalism questioned, what do I do with that? And you do have a few options. Firstly, of course, bullying is illegal, and so there's steps that you can take along those lines. But also, particularly if this behaviour is only sort of shading into bullying, it's not maybe quite there yet, but it's still really difficult for you. I think that there's a couple of ways as Christians that we can approach it. Firstly, I think it's really important that we don't copy it, don't react by actually going to that place ourselves. And secondly, I think that it is always possible to opt out, and that's not necessarily a bad option. And so in my case, I actually shifted into a slightly different role. That meant that that sort of direct contact was no longer part of what I had to deal with day to day, while also trying to be respectful of that boss and again, not undermine them with the rest of the organisation. Didn't always succeed in that, I have to say, not as well as I probably would want to. Because it's very difficult if you feel like someone's been pretty nasty to you. Sometimes you kind of do say to other people, gosh, that person was pretty nasty to me. But in my experience, it's almost always better not to share a lot of your grievances with other people. It's not helpful for the culture, it's not helpful for the organisation, and it's not a very Christ-like example and witness. And so if I were to have my time again, I would probably do even less than I did of telling other people, how I felt about it, or sort of undermining the boss in their eyes. One of there's a couple of other things then that I also want to touch on. If you go to a leadership course, or if you look at leadership kind of writing and trends, you'll see a lot of emphasis on authentic leadership. Anyone heard about authentic leadership? What's going on? Authentic leadership is very popular with management theorists, and it's all about being your true self. And look, in the context of communication, there's a lot to like here. Authentic leadership is about telling the truth. It's about being honest. It's about being transparent. It's about kind of being to your, communicating well to your employees who you are and what your goals are. However, from a Christian perspective and a Christian anthropology, if you like, theory about people and who they are, authentic leadership doesn't always look great, because who people are is not always pretty. And there's no better cover for bullies than thinking that what they're doing is being honest and being authentic. If you talk to people who use demeaning language or who are very harsh in the workplace, you'll often hear them say, I'm just telling it like it is. I'm just being authentic. So I think it's a very interesting thing for us as Christians to think about, what does it mean to be authentic? What does authentic leadership look like? Because I need to be really careful that authentic leadership doesn't just mean giving rein to all of my natural desires, because as a Christian, I know my natural desires aren't necessarily the things that I want to unleash on my workplace. And look, I think ultimately as Christians, we do have a really good way of thinking about authentic leadership. And that is that authentic leadership is about being authentic to who we are in Christ. Authentic leadership is actually about showing Christ in our leadership. Because I tell you what, you wouldn't get a lot of bullying or even miscommunication if our communication was characterised by love and joy and peacemaking and kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. If those were the characteristics of who we were authentically, then I think authentic leadership works fantastically well for us. So as Christians, I do think we need to be authentic and honest, but we need to be authentic and honest to our identity in Christ, to ourselves in Christ, and be aware of what that looks like. I do have to say, though, that you might need to count the cost. So there's two examples that I can tell you about Christians who I think exemplified this in their workplace, but it didn't necessarily end well for them. So one story, which was in a workplace that I was part of, was a leader who was quite humble and was particularly willing to admit mistakes. And so this leader would say, you know what, 3 months ago I decided to do that, but bad idea. We should change our minds on that. We should do something else. Very willing to admit that, you know, he'd got it wrong. But that came at a cost, and when it came time for a promotion, he didn't get the promotion. And the reason, and I found out later because I talked to people who are on the committee, the reason was that he was seen as not a strong enough leader, that he vacillated a little bit too much, and, you know, we didn't chart a course and stick to it. I thought that was a real shame because I thought he was a great leader, and I thought that actually he showed fantastic qualities. But it can come at a cost if you don't conform to what the workplace culture expects of you. There's another example as well, which is of a Christian who worked in the finance industry, not here, but in the US actually. When I lived there, I was associated with people who, you know, worked in finance, and this person refused to deceive his customers. Now that sounds like a pretty ordinary, you know, kind of standard of ethics, right? But actually his company said, you're not making your sales targets, you need to sell this product to your customers. And he said, it's not a good product. It's a product that is going to be much worse for them than these other things over here. And his company said, well, you're not going to make your sales targets. Now he, in his home group, as part of his church, spent 2 years essentially, and the home group walked with him through this process of being fired for being a Christian. Not for being a Christian, obviously, but for maintaining ethics in that particular industry. And they said, look, we think that this is your Christian witness here. In this job, it is your Christian witness to get fired while doing your absolute best, working hard, doing your best for your customers. But if you can't stay in this job as a Christian, behaving ethically, because you can't make the sales targets, because the sales targets require you to deceive your customers, then your witness in that workplace is to get fired, which he did. Came at cost, yes. But look, I think there's a really interesting part of that story which we as Christians also need to take on board, and that is these kind of witnesses are much easier in community. I think it would have been difficult for him to take that stand if he hadn't had his church supporting him, and he hadn't had that long process of them helping to discern, you know, is it you? Are you not working hard enough? Is that the problem with the sales targets? No, it's not that. Is it something that you can fix? No, it's not. Well, we are going to help you discern that and help you discern how to be a Christian witness in this place, and we are actually going to applaud you when you get fired. I think you need a group to help you with that, and Christian community is the place to be. Now, it does require that you have a Christian community around you and you share what's going on in your workplace. They need to know about that stuff if they're going to actually support you through some of those difficult times. So there can be cost. Probably not all the time, because, you know, good communication usually is rewarded in both the short, medium and long term in workplaces. This is kind of stuff that most bosses, if they've got any sort of idea at all, are going to support and applaud. Good communication is almost always going to actually lead to good outcomes for you, but occasionally not. And the situations where it isn't is probably where there's a whole culture that you're fighting against. And I want to leave with just talking a tiny bit about culture, but I'm happy to talk more in question time as well. What do you do if the whole culture is actually against you? Now, if you're in sales, this may be your daily reality. You may be in a sales culture where spin is just expected. And it's very, very difficult for you to fight against that. I think you've got a few options. I think you can choose to opt out. I think that if you are able and you're in a position of authority, you can try to change the culture. As CEO, I can't opt out. The culture is my responsibility, and if I can't take it on, no one can. So I need to actually front up, and even if I'm in an executive role or a team leader, I can still influence my team culture. So if you've got a position of authority, I think you need to actually take the cultural question seriously, because you actually have the power to change it, at least in some small measure. But even if you are at the mercy of the culture, there is, I think, an argument to say that you can be the leaven in the dough. to use a kind of Christian metaphor. By speaking respectfully, by protecting the bullied, by giving credit to others without just taking it for yourself, by telling the truth, being humble, and appreciating others' contributions, by not spinning things, you, I think, can be a witness that is so winsome that it makes others ashamed to act in a different way around you. Again, this is much easier in community. It's much easier if you are not the lone person in the organisation, and it's much easier for you to maintain that if you have support to do that. But it is an option for Christians within the culture. So I do hope that some of these examples might strike a chord with you and might make you think about some ways that we as Christians can respond to different communication in the workplace. Thanks.